The voice. Okay. Hello to everybody. Good morning. Welcome to episode number 80.
80.
You can count on me every week being ridiculously excited by the fact that we've been doing however many we've been doing straight episodes. Some sort of, like Matt saving the day once and us filming a couple in advance, but still 80 straight episodes.
Don't you get syndicated at 100 episodes? So we're almost there. So
just go, but that's a whole new thing to think about, Matt. A whole different conversation. But until we go into syndication, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about, I sort of feel goofy smiling at this. We're going to be talking about hate. I'll explain why I came to that in a moment. But before I launch into that, and actually I forgot to say in the warm-up time, since my warm-up time was shorter this morning, everybody be sure to, and who I didn't get reminded by, it's normally Tom who says all panelists and attendees, if you're in chat, so that everybody can see. Tom, I even took your script line, but be sure if you want to take part in chat to hit all panelists and attendees. And now, before we launch today's episode, I will turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
And thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you. I had this overwhelming feeling before Joanne popped on that when everybody popped on and was just saying hello to their old friends. I felt like we're
old friends.
I felt like we were at one of those 50s Catskills sort of summer cabin place, the summer resorts. Everybody was just showing up. Oh, hey, it's good.
Time for canasta. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was wonderful. Where's my Bloody Mary? Well, it is another week, and we're grateful to have you here. And rules of the game are as follows. If you would please make sure that you use the chat. Use it liberally. Use it conservatively. Use it libertarian. No, I'm just kidding. But use the chat, because we like to hear from you, and we like to have folks like to see what's going on in your minds. Lots of links, lots of stuff. And as always, we save the chat and it is put in our Slack channel. So if you are not on our Slack channel, then you need to be so, because you can access the chat every week and see all the great stuff that our community puts together. If you do have questions for Joanne, in the rare occasion me, but you put those in the Q&A. We do take those from the Q&A because it's a lot easier to track them. So if you have a great idea, even something you want us to just kind of riff on, put that in Q&A, and that makes our lives a lot easier and makes the conversation flow a little bit easier towards the end during our open Q&A time. And excuse me. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can visit us on the web at www.ncheteach.org. Look around, go to the conversations page, and you've already went through there to get to this episode. So hopefully you spent some time looking around. We have some just amazing things coming up. We now have 4 colloquia on our website for next spring. We have NASA. We have the Musicians Hall of Fame in Nashville. We have Mohai in Seattle, and we have the Ford Museum in Detroit. So we are really excited to bring those to you. We'll be announcing in the coming weeks 2 other major grants that we've been working on. One for the National Endowment for Humanities, which is also at NASA, and then another one with the Library of Congress that seeks to work with rural schools. So lots going on here at National Council for History Education. We have tons of webinars coming up, including Kevin Cruz next week. We're also doing one with Brown Choices. So between Yale today, Princeton next week, and Brown, we're doing our Ivy League tour over the next few weeks. Very excited to do that. And I assume Joanne is partial to Yale in that list. So. And with that, I will turn it back over to Joanne. But again, thank you all for being here. And if you could take some time and find out more about some of the great work we're doing, we'd really appreciate it. Always, you can follow us on social media. We are at History Ed. Joanne is at JB1755, JBF1755, and I am Matthew T. Messias. So please find us and enjoy. So Joanne, take it away.
Excellent. Okay, I will take it away. I was pondering what I was going to talk about, and as I always do and swear that I won't, I tend to do that on Thursdays because it's the first day I can breathe pretty much in a week. But yesterday when I was pondering this, what came to mind, and I suppose it's not surprising in any way, is the topic of hate, but not just hate. Boy, there's a lot of it. Don't we see a lot of hate these days? Politics sure has a lot of hate. I was interested in hate as a political tool, which relates to some of what I've talked about before. Hang on a minute. I must close chat because I'll just talk to you guys instead of talking to everybody. Okay, much better. So hate is a political tool. Hate, and I've talked in one way or another about this. I've talked in the past about propaganda. I've talked about how if something is announced and makes you immediately furiously angry, perhaps there's an absolute reason for that, but before you release the furious anger, think about whether the person who just gave you that piece of information really wants you to be furiously angry, and if it's serving a purpose and isn't necessarily an honest expression of an idea. As part of the logistics, the dynamics of propaganda. So there's a lot of hate floating around. There's hate sort of not just throughout our political realm right now, but hate as politics. And so what I wanted to do a little bit was talk about, I suppose, not just hate, but hate stoking, the strategic, deliberate use of hate to have a political impact. In a functional democracy, you have competition, you have ideas competing, you have personalities competing, you have good ideas and bad ideas, you have flawed personalities, but still you have some form of free and fair competition in a fully functional democracy. In a broken democracy, you have suppression and fear trying to take the place of competition, right? You have suppression and fear trying to override the entire system. So if you're trying, in effect, the most effective way to be blatantly anti-democratic is to stoke hate. If you can get people really sort of group hating another group, that's powerful, and that will put people in a position where they will feel that it's entirely justified to do things that normally might not seem particularly democratic, but given hate, just raging hate, they may seem necessary. And the interesting thing, or one of the many interesting things about hate, is if you're talking about group hate, and I'm going to come back to this, I actually read a psychological study in preparation for this episode. If you're talking about group hate, hatred of a group, the powerful thing about that is that it really doesn't matter if individuals are interacting with you or not on a basic level, right? Individuals, or in other words, reality, doesn't have anything to do really with that kind of group-based hate. That's just about getting you to hate a group of people based on their groupness, based on what you have decided means that they're outsider, outlier status. And that's a powerful form of hate because it's not really, much hate is not reality-based, but that one in particular, I could come up to someone and say, well, I'm in that group. Do you hate me? And the person, actually, I've done this on Twitter. You hate liberals. Well, I'm a liberal. Do you hate me? Well, no, actually, we interact really nicely here on Twitter. Yeah, we do. So do you hate liberals? Well, you're a different kind of liberal. So at any rate, hate, group-based hate, is something really powerful. So that's what I decided I wanted to explore a little bit today. Look at a few moments in history where that was used particularly effectively, and you could see it countering and opposing, actually, person-to-person contact and putting up kind of a wall of hate that makes it hard to get beyond. And then I did want to talk a little bit about this study. I'm so proud of myself. Early in the morning, and I'm reading a psychological study for you. I wanted to talk a little bit about that too. It's a study of group-based hate. Actually, I'll read the title. I'll come back to it. The title of the study is "The Central Role of Group-Based Hatred as an Emotional Antecedent of Political Intolerance." Okay, I'm going to come back to that. But at any rate, when I thought about this topic, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to talk about moments in which there's like real group hatred serving a strong political purpose, what would that be? And this will not be surprising to anyone. The first thing that came to mind, only because it's so obvious and so blatant and almost ridiculous in some of the response, is the election of 1800. I know I've already talked about that 3 times, 4 times, I don't know how many times, but what I thought of in thinking about this topic was the fact that in the lead up to that election, you have people of the Federalist persuasion burying their Bibles because they believe that Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans are going to come steal their Bibles. Okay, so that's a response to some real hate-rousing rhetoric and assumptions on the part of, I'm sure, some Federalist sort of church figures, definitely on the part of Federalist partisan newspapers. Federalists are saying in one way or another, Jefferson is an anarchist and Jefferson doesn't believe in God, and that whole group is like that. And if you let them have power, they're going to overturn religion, they're going to overturn the government. Bury your Bibles now, because they're going to get taken away. So that, not surprising as an early American historian, that is the first thing that popped into my mind, but that's a thing, again, grounded on nothing except fear and hatred of this other group, and the assumption that you have to act against this group or they're going to come and get you. And you can see how that kind of an assumption is going to lead to some potentially extreme politics. In the case of that election, things sort of move up to an edge and then they stop. In part because of the, excuse me, political process, which I've also talked about before. Part of what the founding generation was doing in creating that Constitution was putting a process in motion that could be turned back to when things become extreme. And Jefferson himself says that after the 1800 election, when someone says, what would you have done if things had gotten really bad? And Jefferson says, oh, well, we would have, gone back to the Constitution. Maybe it needs a little tweaking, but the process is there. So that was the assumption at the time. But the other thing that popped into my head is a great example of hate being particularly effective at shutting down conversation, shutting down reconciliation, shutting down any kind of communication. And this was an episode that I pass it by. I mentioned it briefly at the end of my most recent book, The Field of Blood. And it has to do with the period just before the Civil War really fully breaks out. And the sort of main character of that book, Benjamin Brown French, who for most of the book is a clerk, he becomes the commissioner of public buildings in the last phase of the book, and he becomes particularly the nation's leading Mason. And he is sitting at his wife's bedside. His wife is sick. She's actually, he may not know this yet, but she's on her deathbed. And what is he doing there? He is writing a letter to Masons, fellow Masons, basically saying to them, look, we are a group. And if we just talk to other Masons and convince them that a lot of what people are feeling right now, not valid, that the fear and the hate, that we don't have to go in that direction. And there's enough of us that maybe we could steer things in a different direction, right? It's admirable. And I remember I got to know him so well in the course of writing that book. It's kind of sweet, it's sort of, I know I'm finishing the book, that there's French, at his wife's deathbed, and he's trying to get people basically to stop hating each other. Sort of one of those moments when as a historian, you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen. I'm so sorry. But at any rate, he tries, right? He's like, this is bad. We're all sort of hating each other. And the Masons and brother Masons are supposed to trust each other, are supposed to always be by each other's side. So the Masons, in his mind, was like a great way to get out of this moment where things have gotten so bad that Northerners and Southerners were just buried in this sort of fear and hatred. He writes the letter, he sends it out, and what happens? He gets back a letter from, I believe, a Virginia Mason, and the Mason says, and this is going to be a horrible paraphrase, but he basically says, are you kidding me? Like your people are going to invade us. They're going to break into our homes. They're going to break and trash our firesides and hurt our families and kill our loved ones. And how dare you beam in here and say, oh, can't we all just get along, when you and your kind are going to kill and destroy us, and you're already on the way. So there's French, who's trying to make a connection and say, you know, the sort of wide river of hatred that's washing over us right now, we can actually stand up to it, because we as brother Masons know that we don't hate each other by definition. We trust each other by definition. And there were Masons in the North and the South who actually were helping each other during the war, you know, helping each other cross lines or helping families cross lines. They were actually like living up to the code of Masonry. But this particular Mason, no, he responds as you would respond if you were really thoroughly convinced and taught that this other side is just out to get you, and that any kind of communication, even from French, who would not have been sort of doing anything particularly hateful before this point, even no matter what you know about French and who he is, no matter what your personal relationship with him was, he's on that side, so he's evil and he can't be trusted. So that, when I was thinking of hatred, I was thinking of the kind of hatred that's deployed, and I suppose particularly in that case, it's a war or before elections, that's aimed at preventing people from thinking about individuals, that's aimed at preventing them from breaking things down to a realistic day-to-day level, and is really intended to get you to imagine some massive, horrible, evil group that can't be reckoned with, that can't be reasoned with, and thus must be fought off. And I suppose you could also say, I won't go into detail of it, but I have this here on my list of bad moments. And one of them, you know, just think about the civil rights struggle and the way in which people were opposing anyone who was working for the civil rights of African Americans at that time, that they were evil, they were horrible, they were out to destroy America. I mean, it's rhetoric that we hear now as well. That kind of rhetoric is aimed at preventing you, discouraging you from thinking about people on the other side as individuals, as people who could be reckoned with. It's aimed at getting people to blindly hate a group because you fear them, because you're angry at them. And when you're in that zone, that's a bad zone to be in. And that's not a zone that a functional democracy works on. So in looking at this morning, in trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about, I will say, yes, I'm proud of myself for reading the psychological study, but I will totally admit I stumbled across it in digging around and Googling around and trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about. And the study, I'll read the title again, The Central Role of Group-Based Hatred as an Emotional Antecedent of Political Intolerance, from Political Psychology Journal from 2009. And it actually uses Israel as its case study. If you want group-based hate, that's a place to go. But what's interesting about the study is, you know, it makes the point. It basically says, you know, when people look at political intolerance and political violence, they tend to look at anger and fear. Those are when you, and in there, I'm going to trust them because I have not read more than one psychological study on this. But based on this study, they say if you review the scientific literature, much of it focuses on fear and anger and political intolerance. And that's the sort of combination of things that people look at. This particular study says we looked more broadly. We asked if those are the two main things that we should be looking at, fear and anger. And we discovered that neither one of them is particularly effective if they're not accompanied by the all-important group hatred. That's the key. That's the thing that really gets people to unite and effectively, in a negative way, join to attack an other, to isolate, identify, and attack an other as being really, you know, you hate them because they're an other, they're not you. And when you've drawn that line, it's not, you're not just saying I'm mad at them, you're not just saying they make me fearful, you're saying I hate them, they are not me. That's a kind of a wall. So, and this is from the study. It says, group-based hatred is the most important antecedent of political intolerance, even when controlling for important intolerance inducers, such psychological study, such as perceived threat. Anger or fear influence political intolerance wholly through the mediation of hatred or perceived threat. And they go on to talk about what does hatred do? How does it work? It rejects a group in a generalized sort of totalistic fashion. It creates an absolute separation between out-group members and in-group members, targeted at fundamental characteristics of people within that group. And the result of this is you end up seemingly having this group of clearly defined evil people. This is where you get the fear and the anger, who are out to get you, who are doing clearly bad things, and you know they are, and you hate them for those things that they are doing. And your goal is to completely restrain or control hated people because they are a danger. And this comes from the article. Haters don't believe in the possibility of improving intergroup relations. They dismiss attempts to change the hated individual. Hatred consists of a willingness to harm and even annihilate the other. There's charming language. The point here being, it's really effective. And we can all sit here and think of countless moments throughout history, and not just American history, when that kind of group hatred, getting people to hate, define another, hate another, lose all hope in even communicating with the other, and that becomes the grounding, the fundamental of a kind of, they use the sort of, I don't know, weak, to me, a weak phrase, political intolerance, really lack of any willingness to engage in any kind of democratic competition at all. But at any rate, that's when you get a situation where there's no ability to have debate and compromise, which is the core of a democratic governance. There's no ability for a free and fair competition, and the majority gets to win. None of that matters, because what you have is one side that's defined the other side as evil, fearful, scary, and must be hated to be a good, in our case, to be a good American. You must hate those people. You can see, based on everything that I've said here, and you don't need the psychological study to think this, but still, you can see the power of that in pulling from people a kind of passion that almost can't, by definition, can't be reasoned with. And, you know, as someone who deliberately at various points goes onto Twitter to try to engage with people who I know disagree with me, and partly tries to rely on the fact that, as I suggested a moment ago, but you and I sort of engage here, person who doesn't agree with me and I, like we've talked about things that aren't political. So do you really hate me? More often than not, the person will say, no, I don't hate you. My hope, well, that's just a real Freudian slip there. My hope is that that kind of little slip, that kind of willingness of someone to say, well, no, I know that you're a Democrat, that you're democratic, capital D, but no, I don't hate you. You seem like a decent person, would be enough to at least get people to question, oh, do I really hate everyone on that side, or should I actually think about that? But for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, that's a hard thing to do. And so I guess in the end, that partly bringing us back to the present, partly makes me think about the fact that, you know, what we're watching on a daily, hourly basis is attempts on the right, some on the right, to really get people going and looking at the left as being, you know, dangerous, horrible, evil people who need to sort of line up or be attacked in some potentially violent way. And that's the other side. That one of the reasons why I don't love the phrase political intolerance is because it masks some of what political intolerance is about, which is threats and violence, right? If you really feel that someone is a danger, and if you really feel that it's patriotic to fight them, then violence is going to feel justified. And by the time you've decided that this other team doesn't deserve to be included within the national us, you've ruled yourself out of democracy already, right? Democracy is based on competition, even between good and bad ideas, right? Democracy isn't about wonderful, noble, lofty ideas banging up against each other and then one wins. Democracy is just about ideas banging up against each other. And there are really bad ideas that can be wholly part of a democratic competition. They always are, right? So when I talk about democracy, and I, over the last 79 episodes, have pleaded for the significance of democracy, and obviously value it beyond the beyond. In doing so, I'm not saying that it is always good, but I am saying it is based on competition. It is based on the ability of people, us, we the people, to make a choice that shapes the way that the nation is run. And if you are declaring that people whose ideas aren't like yours are by definition un-American and don't deserve to have a voice and don't deserve to vote, and if you're trying to find ways to rule them out of the system so that they will not sort of be allowed to voice what they're thinking, you're moving well beyond the democratic sphere. The easiest way, the best way to be blatantly anti-democratic is to ground those actions on hate and fear, right? I mean, it's patriotic and wonderful to make it harder to vote if you've convinced people that this other side is breaking all kinds of rules, doing all kinds of horrible things. They're horrible. They must be blocked out, despite the fact that there's no evidence that that happened. But if you can convince people of that, then you've actually made a case for why it's okay to be seemingly blatantly anti-democratic. So this is a long kind of roundabout way of saying that it's not enough, I think, right now to watch what's going on and say, wow, like there's a lot of hate in politics. There's like the real threat of violence in politics. Things are really ugly. This is really bad. Democracy is in danger, all of which I think are true. I think the next step to that is what can happen? What can we do to not just accept the wall, right? To not just say like, yeah, we're all just one big wall of people and you can just line us up and you can all just hate us. And, how do we break down the barrier? And I don't think the answer is, although I still try somewhat, I don't know if it's foolishly or not, to sort of one by one pick people off on Twitter and say like, you don't hate me, right? So what does that mean about hating all liberals? I want us to be able to think about the dynamic of what's going on and the fact that some of the people on the top pushing the hatred and pushing the emotion and gunning literally and figuratively for Americans to really get angry at the other group, that isn't just normal politics, that isn't just the passions of politics, that's a deliberate ploy to cut that other group out of the system to justify any and all actions against that other group. That it's a deliberate, strategic, political action. It's a dark one, it's an ugly one, but it should not be looked at as, oh, well, politics is ugly nowadays. It should be looked at as a strategy, and we should think about it in that way and evaluate it in that way. And I'm not going to, as ever, I don't come on here and have a great response, so I can't say the thing to do now is. What I can say is recognizing what's actually happening, the real dynamics of what's happening, and thinking about the best response to that as opposed to the best response to, boy, isn't politics bad, at least puts us into a conversation that's grappling with the logistics of a broken democracy. So I'm already running out of time. I guess I will stop there. I realize this is a very sweeping and broad topic that I brought up, an issue that I brought up. And I also realize there are all kinds of ways in which the us and the them can be flipped on their head. I'm aware of that, but not all us's and thems are trying to eliminate access to the political system. So I'll throw that out there. But I do think, as ever, and this has been true from the very beginning of History Matters, I think it's so important to understand the dynamics of what's going on and not just to inhale the sort of ethos of it, but understand what's going on so that you can respond in a more strategic, in a more intelligent way, and potentially find some ways to at least counter some of what we see around us, rather than having us, in responding to those kinds of actions, also collapse into just emotion, unthinking emotion. That it's the thinking part that's important. And actually, that's one of the points that article that I made read. It's uninformed group hatred is the real danger, right? I read that this morning and I thought, great. So we live amongst, fake news. We'll be sure that we have uninformed political intolerance. But at any rate, what I'm trying to do here is get us to think about the dynamics and the logistics and what is really happening around us here as it happens, and not just to swallow it as organic in some way, because it isn't. It isn't. It's a plot. It's a ploy. It's a technique. It's a strategy. And some people need to recognize that for what it is. And we need to think about the ways to counter that, to get past that, to get people to think beyond blind group hate. And I have no great answer to that, and I wish I did. This is not the first time in doing History Matters that as I've been talking, in the back of my head, I've been going, where's the solution? And I don't have it. But I think it's important to recognize the reality of what's going on around us. Okay. And I see mug. Okay, so now this was tricky today. I thought the mug of hate. What is the mug of hate? I don't have the mug of hate. So I went for the opposite. I went for the mug of love. This is the anti-hate mug. This is, and he's telling you, I believe, it says, "Good morning, I'm cute, and that's the news," by Newbie the History Bird. So this was, I do not have hate in my cupboard in my kitchen. But Newbie, little does he know right now, he's just staring at his wing. What are you doing over there? I don't know. But he represents the anti-hate motto for today's episode. I just love that picture.
That is a great picture.
Yeah. Okay.
I do have the mug of hate today, ironically.
Oh. Okay. Ooh, you do have the mug of hate.
The mug of hate today. I thought, why not?
That's very effective.
Thank you.
Wow.
There's and so my favorite little piece of Vader trivia, of course, is that there is a grotesque of Vader's head on the National Cathedral. And on the North Tower of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., there is a grotesque of Vader's head. So look it up. It's fascinating. It was added, it would be due to a children's competition in the 1980s. So
as opposed to Bodie McBoatface, we got Darth Vader in the competition.
The grotesques at the National Cathedral are just amazing. So so I am in a church today. Mother Emanuel, that's a very good guess, but it is not. This is actually the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, famous, and this is from Montgomery, Alabama, famous because it is the first church that Martin Luther King Jr. preached at following his seminary work at Boston University. And this is where the Montgomery bus boycott was, all the meetings and everything came out of this church. And so I along with you, Joanne, I went with the opposite of hate.
I'm all for that. But you even had hate represented in
yes, the Vader mug was an afterthought. It happened to be like just sitting there, and I couldn't resist. But
no, it was excellent. And I will, of course, point out that Carolee has already posted a link to the gargoyle at the because this is what our people do. This is what you guys do. You were like, bam, and Carolee especially, right in the mix. Oh, and I should say, this is a Carolee mug. How could I not give Carolee credit for the Carolee Newbie mug of love and cuteness? Got Mary Poppins mentioned on the other side too. But anyway, much love to Carolee for providing me with the mug of love and the mug of hate. I love the fact that we're like
I almost went with the Avett Brothers house, which would have been a little bit creepy because they're not so famous that wouldn't be creepy. Because they wrote a song called "The Ballad of Love and Hate," which I love. So
okay.
I went with something a little bit more historic.
No, I like it's good. Go with love and compassion. Excellent.
Jeannie's. Let's start with questions. Jeannie, great question. Because it was a big part of our conversation today. Are there books or articles on the impact of Freemasonry on early American history? How significant was their impact? And Dan Brown does not count.
No, Dan Brown does not count. There are some. When I was working on my book, I found one that was about, and I'm not going to remember the name of it. There was one about Freemasonry and the Civil War, along the lines of what I suggested in my comments, that Freemasons, by definition, are supposed to trust and help brother Masons. And that was true for Northerners and Southerners as well as for anyone else. So, and it's probably lurking, I'm guessing, back there somewhere. You can't see. On the other side of this bookcase is my desk and my computer, and then on the floor are like reams of books. So I think the floor books contain that. But there is a book about the Masons and the Civil War. There are broader books about the Masons. I don't have one title that I can throw at you, but yeah, I mean, they were influential. They were all the way back, in a sense, to the beginning of the Republic. George Washington was a Mason. Benjamin Brown French, who's like really an ardent Mason, he notes there's a point in his diary where he talks about, can't remember now, is it Buchanan is the first president he sees wearing a Mason apron? I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was Buchanan. At any rate, he's always on the lookout for Masons. So they do have an influence, but I don't know, someone might know better than me. I see someone floor books. Yeah, someday when I'm not doing my normal film, someday in the after party, when my apartment is not as scary as it is now, I can show you the scary office back there with the floor books. But the Better Angels of Our Nature. Is that the book, Dale? Are you suggesting the title of the book? Now we're back to National Treasure. Yes, that might be it. That sounds familiar to me. At any rate, the short answer is yes, I believe there are. I don't know off the top of my head the title. Better Angels of Our Nature, I think, is the one that I was just thinking of with like the purple or blue cover that's particularly about the Civil War.
I bet this is totally off subject, and so it's more of a mention than anything else, but I imagine as historians, given sort of when Dan Brown became famous with, for Robert Langdon and those stories, there was this sort of influx of historical quote unquote books about the Masons and the Illuminati and all the other stuff that Dan Brown imagines. And I think, so I just as an aside, and I don't know, Joanne, if you can comment on this, did that make historians work harder? Like when things become sort of mythologized in the national psyche, does that make historians work just that much harder? Because I know you went through this with Hamilton as well, right?
Well, right. I mean, yes. So, and some things always, like the Civil War and World War II. There are some topics that are perennially mythologized some way, and the founders for that matter. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think as soon as something is mythologized, and particularly if it's newish seeming, so like Gore Vidal's novel Burr, right? People weren't used to mythologized Burr. It's been a while since someone has asked me this, but there was a period of time way back when I spent a lot of time contradicting that book. Right? I was like, well, it's fiction. There's a lot in there that's true, but it's fiction. So yeah, it does make historians work harder, in part because sometimes the myth is so interesting to people and so flashy that they want that to be true and are less interested in anything outside of that. Although I will say that more often than not, the truth is far more interesting and can be far flashier, but you have to get people to let go of the flashy thing. And yeah, Hamilton the musical in some ways has done that as well. So it does make historians work harder. I think there's a glass half full, glass half empty way of looking at that, right? So the half full way is, I've got your attention in history now, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking in my direction now. So I'm going to use that opportunity and I'm going to teach against it. Mm-hmm. That was always my response to the Hamilton musical, is it got people so interested in the founding period. Excellent. Then they're going to be even more likely to hear what I have to say. And there are ways to say that's wrong without sounding like you're saying, I hate that musical, which no one would then listen to you. So, yes. And I don't hate the musical. But yeah, but the myths have power, a power that kind of along the lines of what I was just talking about, right? The myths have power that you can deploy, you can use for good purpose, strategic.
Yeah, and that's part of what made me think about it, because there are so many myths within the realm of hate that are deployed strategically and politically today, and I imagine throughout the U.S. history, to shape the national narrative in ways that are deeply problematic. I mean, we did McCarthy. We talked about McCarthy how many years, a few weeks back. Another example. So
yeah.
Sorry, everybody. I've been dominating the conversation. I haven't had a chance to talk to Joanne in a while. This is really
We actually haven't talked in a little while. It's
I know. Dale's question, I think, is a good one as well. Understanding the role of hate in the election of 1800, and I assume in the Adams presidency, was the tactic prevalent in the first administration with the reverence held for Washington?
Well, not initially, right? So Washington's second term was different from his first term. His first term, reverence is the right word. People were very respectful. They weren't criticizing him. He did not deal well with criticism. So his second term, he was not a happy camper for a chunk of it. What people ended up doing, I suppose, in a way, it was attacking Washington, but it was not really attacking Washington. It was claiming that he was being monarchical. So in other words, in the second term was when they began saying, well, he's trying to recreate or push people back towards monarchy. They weren't so much saying you, George Washington, are evil, but they were kind of saying, well, he's on that side that's interested in doing this bad thing of not allowing the small R Republican government to survive. But the sort of us versus them hate, it's not till so 1792 is the beginning of like real Federalist versus Republican, like real antipathy. 93, it gets much worse because of the French Revolution and what's going on there. But I think really it's under Adams's presidency that you get the real sort of raging in the street, people angry at each other, wearing different color cockades on their hat to represent which side they're on. Adams describes some of that street activity. He uses the word terrorism. He and Jefferson in their old age, their wonderful correspondence in their old age, when they're both ex-presidents. I think it's Jefferson's has found some way to sort of suggest things weren't so bad, it wasn't so bad. And Adams says, not so bad. Like, were your servants in your house have guns in case people broke into your house? And were people not running around the streets? What? And this is actually, I think, a direct quote. What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? Oh, okay. But yeah. So that kind of language, Adams at least pinpointed it for that time. And that is when you're beginning to get more violence. And in the election of 1800 is when you do begin to get people collecting arms in at least 2 states in case the election needs to be taken. So, excuse me.
Okay. Can I apologize for everybody, but there's an interesting thread here, and I'm really interested to hear what Joanne thinks about it, is this idea of ex-presidents, because we've talked about it in the past, but I've also, we also sort of noticed this, that ex-presidents are frequently band together against, even when they were political enemies prior to that. I mean, look at the friendship between Obama and Bush, and as you said, Jefferson and Adams, and so I wonder, as a historian, is there anything there that folks should pay attention to about how ex-presidents think about the past, especially when it comes to times of hate, strife, conflict, that kind of stuff? Can we learn from our ex-presidents better than we can our current political leaders, I guess is the question I'm getting at.
Well, ex-president is a mighty small club, right?
Mm-hmm.
So given that, under most circumstances, it seems likely that people who have had that highly unusual position in life are going to be able to be friendly towards each other. It's an interesting question that I'm not sure of the answer of, because at various points in recent years, some part of me has thought, what if all the ex-presidents got together and made a statement about what they thought was good or bad, or dangerous or not dangerous? And wouldn't that have a power if you had presidents of all parties, all kinds, all coming together to make some kind of statement? Would that have a power? And if for no other reason, partly because it would be all these presidents, but also deliberately, expressly, because they would be from different political persuasions coming together to say something supportive about democracy, about the functioning of democracy and the survival of democracy. I think on that level, there's a power to it. But as far as their view of history having an impact, in and of themselves, I'm not sure. The only way that might, and this is literally off the top of my head, if you got, like Bush and Obama, people whose politics are opposed coming together, and Jefferson and Adams, whose politics end up being opposed, coming together and being able to have a discussion, for the most part, genial civil discussion about how they understand the past, then yeah, that could say a lot. It could say a lot individually from each person, and most important of all, watching them respond to each other would reveal a lot about what was underlying some of what's going on in the past. But I think, and I don't know, it's at various points I've been surprised that all the past presidents haven't gotten together and said something. But I think that's offers you such a distinctive vantage point on America and the world. By definition, you're going to see things and understand things, regardless of your political persuasion, that nobody else will see or understand.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on, and thank you for taking a stab at that very convoluted question. Because excuse me, I think what's always interesting to me when I read this particular, or the founding period of history, I love those letters back and forth between the founding fathers once they're kind of out of power and not in the public sphere as much. And it's more reflective, it's more thoughtful, and they're trying to shape their own narrative in history and all that kind of good stuff.
But they're not being strategic in the here and now with their politics.
Right.
For the most part, they're, when Jefferson and Adams are writing to each other, they're writing to each other, and they're not assuming, in their case, there's an exchange in which I can't remember which one says to the other one, that the postmaster wants to read our letters to each other. Right. Weird? That's not the assumption there. They're and I think there's even a statement in one of the letters about, like, you and I should make ourselves understood to each other before time passes and we can't do that anymore. So that's part of what they're trying to do. Although Adams is doing that in a more fulsome spirit, right? Adams is like, let's talk about everything, and I'm going to accuse you of things that I've always thought about you, and you could respond, right? And Jefferson
all in good fun.
Yes, I know. Jefferson is like, let's talk about this. Interesting point, Mr. Adams, as I ignore it now and move in a different direction. But still, those, as a historian, right? That's wonderful. Again, you have to take it as it is in the time it's being offered, in the context it's being offered, so that you can't read a letter from 1810 between these two guys and say it's the truth in that moment. It's interesting to consider what it means in that moment. But that kind of sincere reflection, as a historian, this is the good stuff, not deliberately public-minded.
So getting back to questions from the audience, and thank you for indulging me today, everybody.
What I see mostly in chat is people talking about how they have no room for books. Which makes perfect sense, because very often when I bring up a book, like, oh, there's a book with a blue cover on Masons during the Civil War, and someone was like, it's like, this is you guys. These guys they're good. They're good.
Elizabeth, I'm going to respectfully disagree with you and not listen to you. I think you asked a very good question, which is, I'm going to reframe it very, very, very slightly, but I think it's a good one, which is, when you think about our history, and I think specifically in the founding era, did various factions do the name calling, like, as much as we do today? Like, there's a lot of name calling, especially on social media. Ted Cruz and Kevin Cruz got into a big Twitter argument yesterday, which I thought was hilarious, right? I'm kind of curious, like, what, you know, did they use this sort of name calling people stupid and not so many words or anything like that strategically, or were they just mad, or did they not do it at all? Was it coded? How could you talk a little bit about that rhetoric?
Well, I mean, so some of that would have been in newspapers with no formal name attached, right? So the most free flying stuff of that sort would be that, right? Because there's no name attached. Because it is true in this period that if you go to someone, you know, if you are a gentleman and you go to another gentleman and say, you know, you're a liar, bad things can happen. So there's a penalty to making certain kinds of charges, which I suppose the argument always was like, that's why dueling is good, because if you're afraid you're going to die, you're going to watch what you say because there's a big penalty for it. But yeah, I mean, I suppose in one way or another, there's always, it varies in the time and in the mode of, you know, how language is used, but there's always that kind of nastiness, and some of it's always personal. I'm trying to think of an example. Well, you know, I mean, I could sit here and reel off things that Federalists said about Thomas Jefferson, like personal things that Federalists said about Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, well, also the vice versa, things that Republicans said about John Adams. In some sense, that's, but I think what's interesting about that question is, I think some comments like that are said, and I'm not going to quite mean this the way it's going to come out, but in a spirit of fun, meaning it's an election and you say some stupid thing like that, and that's what happens during election season. And some things have a deeper or a darker purpose. I think both of those things happen across time. I mean, I think, you know, the reason why, or one reason why the founding generation so feared demagogues is because what demagogues do is rile up the passions and emotions of the public to get what they want, which is precisely what we're talking about here, right? That's the, if we're talking about hate and anger and fear, that's the fodder, that's the tool box of the demagogue. So they're assuming from the very beginning, you know, they're writing the Constitution and with the full awareness that that's going to be there, has always been there as part of politics, particularly part of a democratic politics in which the people have a lot of power and the people are also easily swayed, and that connection, those two things, put democratic governments in danger. Just because.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think, thank you so much for that. We have a couple minutes, so there's a couple questions I definitely want to get to. Miriam, I'm going to build on Miriam's because I was, as you were talking, I was feverishly looking on Google Scholar, and I found this great article from 2017 by Chirian George called Hate Spin. And this proposes that hate spin absorbs the familiar concept of hate speech or incitement and combines it with a less understood strategy of offense taking or manufactured indignation, which I think is just kind of fascinating, but it felt like it fit with what we were talking about today. And Miriam asks, I think many people engaging in the kind of hate described in the study that you were talking about earlier are being manipulated by unscrupulous politicians and power brokers. How do we combat this on an individual level and on a greater level?
Boy, isn't that a question?
Yeah, so we have 3 minutes, so you can take your time.
Well, and that was, the article talks a lot about misinformation, lack of information, and how those things make it very easy for all the spinning to take place. Where did I just see here? Beth said haters hate evidence. Yeah, I mean, that's true, right? And if you're in the hate zone, you're just going to deny that it's evidence, and you're going to find ways to pretend that it's not true. And we're all in that moment. Anyone on social media in any way lives in that world constantly. You know, if the question is, what do we do about that? I don't have the answer to that. I think misinformation and lack of information, we all can say now realistically as opposed to theoretically, that's a danger to democracy, because without factual evidence, you can believe anything. And once you believe anything, it's going to drive you into an emotional state that's going to drive you to do things that you would not do if you were in a clear and informed state of mind. I don't think I have the answer as to what to do, except that even though, despite the amount of time I see on social media or in the news when people make a claim and someone else says, oh yeah, well, this, if at least there's an impulse to say, oh yeah, well, this, there's at least a hope that you might get down to fact, which is a really sort of frighteningly optimistic thing of me to say, because, like more often than not, what'll happen is someone will say something and I'll say, no, like here's actually a study, and they talk to 8,000 people, and the person will come back with a piece of evidence from like rando one-page newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be like, well, yeah, but rando one-page newspaper says this. And then particularly as an academic, an Ivy League academic, then I end up feeling like I'm going to sound like, well, let's consider the credentials of the publication. It's like, how do you? It's.
But it's an important point. It really is. You can't. All evidence is not equal. I mean,
no, it's totally true. But there has to be a way to say that without sounding like you're calling someone stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I mean, I think it's impossible to have a conversation with someone if you suggest to them that they are stupid for believing what they believe. It's not going to happen. Even if you think like, how can you believe that you have to start so that they feel that you are actually hearing them. If you have any hope of engaging in any kind of a dialogue with people. Newbie agrees. That got a very strong chirp.
Well, let me ask one last question, because I think it's a good way to wrap up for the day, which is, and we have 2.5 minutes because we didn't get started until 10:03. So Kathleen asks, do you think some of this hate is a result of a loss of collective memory in our society, or a loss of common purpose? Do we need a common narrative to hold us together at this stage?
That's a really interesting question. I talk a lot about, and I've written about, and I think a lot about what I always call the lack of a we, that a sort of sense of a we. It's not very strong right now. And the most blatant evidence of that is an unwillingness to put on a mask for no other reason than that you're helping somebody else, right? If it's like freedom, I'm not putting a mask on, that you're showing no thought about anyone except really your immediate freedom. And that's not a we kind of a way of thinking about things. I have lost track of where the question was going though. Repeat the question for me again.
Oh, I clicked off of the question. 1 second.
This is bad.
You were going so good. I didn't. Okay.
I was. This is the point in the semester where like halfway through and, I sort of like,
yeah. Do you think some of this hate is a result of a loss of collective memory in our society, or a loss of common purpose?
Got it.
Do we need a common narrative to hold us together?
Right. And so that's, in a sense, that's two different questions. So the first question is, yeah, I do think there's a lack of common purpose. I do think there's a lack of a sense of community. And I do think that the community that social media creates is not a real community, and has all kinds of problems within it. So that's not a replacement. So I do think that's true. As far as a common narrative, that's a separate question. It's a really interesting question. I do think if I were to sit here and say that as Americans, we at least should agree on the importance of democracy and public opinion, the importance of free and fair elections, all of these things that sound really obvious and right now are not, that would expose the problem with saying that, we need to have common beliefs. I don't know what it means when you have people who just kind of aren't buying into the fundamental sort of assumptions about just small d democratic governance. I don't know. I also don't know if we've ever had one narrative, when you say a common narrative, there probably never has been one. Where right now we're at a sort of culture war, history war moment in which it's more blatant that we don't have one. But I do think we need, as Americans, to have a sense of we, however we get that. And we really don't have that now to a kind of alarming degree. And that's, not unrelated to where we started in today's episode, which is if you can just say these people over here are bad and dangerous and don't count, and they need to be either eliminated or silenced, that you have by definition announced that there is no American we. And there have been problems in that we. There's never been an ideal we moment ever in American history, but there have been moments when at least we could all recognize the fact that it was something to strive for. And right now, I think we're kind of lost at this moment. We don't, there's a sense that things are wrong and we need to be better. And some people who are not necessarily pushing in a useful direction, and some people who are pushing in a more useful direction, but nobody really knows the best way out of this kind of morass. I do think, to sort of end on a slightly better note, that evaluating and thinking about what people are saying and the truthfulness of it matters. And I saw us flipping by somewhere in the chat about being teachers and focusing on that. I think that becomes this vitally politically important thing now for teachers to do. And everyone knows that, I know, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it's so important that teachers are doing this, that they're doing this politically, civically important thing that has to be done if there's any hope of us sort of moving to a better place. I should just pick topics where I have the answer. I should just pick topics where I could say, and what we need to do is, but it's the being a political historian right now, saying don't sit back, step forward, say something, I can say that a lot, but I don't have the answer. And I find that frustrating sometimes, that I'm somehow supposed to have some kind of an answer as a historian. But, I don't. Part of why I do this and podcasts and writing and everything else that I'm doing is in the hope of stirring up discussion that together we can find our way towards something that will be helpful and not hurtful at a time of danger to democracy.
Well, I cannot think of a better way to end today's episode. And so I set you up and you delivered in spades. That was amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Well, I'm going to, before you close, you give your goodbye, I want to say right after that comment, that when I say every Friday, thank you for taking part in democracy on Friday morning, that's what I'm talking about, is that we come here together to talk. We don't necessarily know where we're going. I have an idea. I usually have like a 2-page outline, but together, ideally, we can find our way towards solutions that independently we can't come up with. And that's democracy. So being here is wonderful. Creating this community and sticking with it is wonderful. But having these kinds of conversations that can lead to good things is not just wonderful, it's important.
Well, I thank everybody for being here and for spending our time here. I fully agree this community is a impossibly large step forward in trying to make the world a better place in all the ways you described. And so thank you, everybody. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, you can join us on the web, join us on social media, find Joanne and myself on social media, and hopefully you will continue this conversation into your own lives, and with the hope that we can eradicate hate in all the ways that we possibly can. And then for those of you who have only minor flesh wounds, and if you're reading the chat, you'll get that joke, then we will see you at the after party. So Joanne, I'll let you.
As always, my after party moment. We are now going to segue to the after party, which I will also apologize is going to be, at least for me, very brief again today for reasons I'll explain in the after party. If you are here and just generally through the link from NCHE, just stay here. And as I always say every week, poof, this will become the after party. And all that means is we will no longer be recording our conversation so that we could be a little freer and easier in what we're talking about. Just a more casual conversation when the community gets to be even more of a wonderful History Matters community. If you are on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party and enter the after party through the NCHE link, which is ncheteach.org/conversations. Either way, if you are at the after party, you will at least see me for a little while before I venture back to Philadelphia. I'll explain that momentarily. If you don't come to the after party, I will see you next week when we will have another topic, and it won't be hate. I don't know what it'll be, but it won't be hate. So maybe I'll be able to find something a little bit more uplifting next week. Although Newbie has been quietly chattering this whole time. I don't know if anyone could hear him, but he was into it. So at any rate, okay, everyone have a safe, good week. After party people, I will be here and we will be talking within moments. And I'm going to save, I always save the chats. I see lots of poof, the poof.
Yes. And I did stop the live stream, Blake.
And I'm not going to, you guys trying to make me say things. So